The first blow shattered the heavy oak door, sending splinters flying into the dimly lit hovel. The second tore it from its iron hinges. Framed in the gaping doorway, silhouetted against the storm-racked night, stood not the beast of local legend, but something far worse. A man whose stillness held more menace than any howl. Rain lashed at his fine black coat, but not a single drop touched the polished leather of his boots as he stepped across the threshold. His eyes, the color of twilight, scanned the squalor before settling on the woman huddled by the dying hearth. A small, trembling bundle was clutched in her arms. He said nothing. He didn't have to. The air crackled with a power centuries old, a pressure that made the very stones weep with dread. But when the woman looked up, her face pale with terror and smeared with soot, he saw not the face of a stranger. He saw the ghost of his own damnation. It was Ilara, the woman who had sold him to the hunters for a handful of silver a lifetime ago. And the child in her arms had his eyes. Wait, before the next revelation unfolds, if this mystery has already captivated you, let us know where you're following this story from. To ensure you don't miss unexpected alliances or awakened powers, subscribe and join our circle. The game is about to change. Now, back to the scene. Cassian moved deeper into the room, his presence snuffing out the meager warmth of the fire. The scent of stale bread, damp earth, and something metallic, fear, filled his senses. It was a pathetic scene, a world away from the gilded cages and perfumed courts he now frequented. He had spent the last century building an empire of shadows, a fortress of wealth and influence so vast that no hunter would ever dare to whisper his name again. He had hunted his betrayers, one by one, across continents and decades, leaving a trail of exquisite, cold-blooded vengeance in his wake. All but one. Ilara had vanished as if the earth had swallowed her whole. He had imagined this moment 1,000 times, scripting her pleas, savoring the symphony of her terror. Yet the reality was a discordant note. The woman before him was not the defiant, bright-eyed girl who had traded his life for her freedom. This was a wraith, hollowed out by hardship, her beauty eroded by a poverty so profound it clung to her like a shroud. Her once fiery hair was a tangled, lifeless brown, and the hands that clutched the swaddled infant were raw and chapped. The only thing that remained of the girl he remembered was the flicker of terror in her wide green eyes, terror he had put there. "Cassian," she breathed, her voice a dry rasp, the name a forbidden prayer. He allowed himself a small, cruel smile. "You remember." It was not a question. "I confess, I'm disappointed. I pictured a more spirited reunion. Perhaps in a sun-drenched villa, paid for with my blood money. Not this hovel." He gestured vaguely at the crumbling walls, the single rickety chair, the bucket catching drips from the thatched roof. The child in her arms stirred, letting out a soft whimper. Cassian's gaze dropped to the bundle, his smile faltering. The infant was small, impossibly so, its face pinched and pale, but the eyes that blinked open were his. Not the twilight shade of his vampiric nature, but the deep, stormy gray they had been in his mortal life, a detail no one but Ilara could have possibly known. The shock was a physical blow, a stake of ice through his cold heart. He had believed his line extinguished, his human life a forgotten prologue to an endless, blood-soaked night. Yet here was impossible proof to the contrary. A Vampir, a child born of a vampire and a human, a creature of two worlds belonging to neither. "He is not what you think," Ilara whispered, misinterpreting his silence. She tightened her hold on the child, a futile gesture of protection. "He is no monster, isn't he?" Cassian's voice was dangerously soft. He took another step, the floorboards groaning under his weight. "He is half of me, and I, my dear Alara, am most certainly a monster." He crouched down, bringing himself to her level. The scent of her blood was a familiar torture, a maddening perfume he had last inhaled the night she'd pressed a Judas kiss to his cheek while Hunter's blades slid between his ribs. "What is his name?" She hesitated, her throat working. "Leo." "Leo," Cassian repeated, testing the name on his tongue. He reached out a gloved hand, his long, elegant fingers hovering just above the child's head. Leo's tiny hand uncurled, his fingers brushing against Cassian's leather-clad thumb. There was no jolt of power, no mystical connection, just the simple, warm touch of a living child. It was unsettling. He had not felt such warmth in 100 years. He snatched his hand back as if burned. "Why are you here? In Blackwood, on the very edge of my domain? Did you think I would not find you? Did you come seeking my protection or my wrath?" Tears finally welled in Alara's eyes, spilling down her grimy cheeks. "They are hunting him," she choked out. "The Order." Cassian's blood ran cold. The Order of the Dawn. Fanatical, ruthless hunters who had plagued his kind for centuries. They were the very ones Alara had sold him to. "The Order you so loyally served?" he sneered. "Have your old masters turned on you? How tragic." "They know what he is," she pleaded, her voice cracking. "They call him an abomination. They followed me from the continent. I had nowhere else to run. I heard whispers that a powerful lord ruled these lands, a lord who kept the Order at bay." She looked at him, her gaze a raw, desperate appeal. "I did not know it was you. I swear it." He laughed, a harsh, humorless sound that echoed in the small space. "You fled to the one place in the world you should have avoided, a master stroke of foolishness. Or perhaps a final, desperate gamble." He rose to his full height, looming over her. "You come to my doorstep with my son in your arms, a son I never knew existed, hunted by our mutual enemies. You beg for mercy from the man whose life you shattered. The irony is exquisite." The storm outside raged, a fitting chorus to the tempest in the room. He could kill her. It would be so easy. A flick of his wrist. He could take the child, this unexpected, impossible legacy, and raise him in the shadows, teach him the ways of the night. But what would he teach him? Vengeance? Cruelty? An eternity of bitter solitude? He looked from the terrified woman to the vulnerable child, and for the first time in a century, Cassian felt something other than rage or contempt. He felt weary. He had built his immortal life on the foundations of his betrayal. His hatred for Alara was the cornerstone of his existence. To forgive her would be to rip out that cornerstone, to risk the entire edifice of his being crumbling into dust. But to kill her, to leave this child motherless, to become the very monster the Order claimed he was. "The Order will not stop," she whispered, her words barely audible above the wind. "They are led by a prelate, a man named Valerius. He is zealous." Valerius. The name hit Cassian like a physical blow. He remembered Valerius, the young, cruel acolyte with eyes that burned with righteous fire. He had been there the night Cassian was taken, his face illuminated by the torchlight as he'd held the silver chains. So, his old tormentor had risen through the ranks. This changed things. This was no longer just about Ilara's betrayal. It was about his own past, roaring back to claim him. Valerius would not be hunting a mere Vampir. He would be hunting the father. He would be hunting him. Ilara and the child were not just a ghost from his past. They were bait. "You have brought a wolf to my door, Ilara," he said, his voice a low growl. A very persistent, very dangerous wolf. "I know," she sobbed, burying her face in the child's blanket. "I know. Kill me if you must." "It is what I deserve, but please protect him. He is innocent." He watched her, a broken woman offering her life in exchange for her son's. The same woman who had once sold his for a pittance. He should feel triumph. He should relish this moment, the absolute power he held over her fate. Instead, he felt a profound emptiness. Vengeance, it seemed, was a feast that left him starving. What was one more ghost in a life already crowded with them? Killing her would solve nothing. Valerius would still be out there. The child would still be a target. And he would still be alone. An idea began to form in his mind. A cold, calculated, and utterly insane proposal. An alliance, a pact, a way to use this crisis to his advantage, to finally end the threat of the order in his lands, and to deal with the two inconvenient specters who had just appeared on his doorstep. It was a dangerous game, one that would force him to confront the very betrayal that had defined him. It would mean keeping her close, this constant, living reminder of his pain. He extended a hand, not to strike, but to offer. A silent command. Trembling, Ilara looked from his hand to her face, confusion warring with fear in her eyes. Slowly, hesitantly, she placed her hand in his. Her skin was rough but warm. He pulled her to her feet, his touch surprisingly gentle. She swayed, weak from hunger and exhaustion. "You will not die tonight, Ilara," he said, his voice devoid of all emotion. "Neither of you. But mercy has a price." He looked down at the child, who now slept peacefully in her arms, oblivious to the monstrous bargain being struck over his head. "You will live under my roof. You will eat at my table. You will want for nothing. You and my son will be protected." Relief, pure and overwhelming, flooded her features. "Thank you," she stammered. "Cassian, thank you." "Do not thank me yet," he cut in, his grip tightening on her hand. His twilight eyes bored into hers, cold and unforgiving. "In return, you will do exactly as I say. You will be my guest, my prisoner, and my bait. You will help me destroy Valerius and his fanatics. You will be the ghost I use to haunt my hunter." He leaned closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that was more terrifying than any shout. "You betrayed me to the order once. Now you will help me betray them in turn. And when it is over, we will settle the matter of your own debt. Do we have an agreement?" She stared at him, trapped between the devil she knew and the fanatics hunting her. There was no choice. There never had been. She was a pawn in a game played by monsters and saints, and her only hope for survival was to align herself with the monster she had created. With a shuddering breath, she gave a single, desperate nod. "I agree." Cassian released her, stepping back. The pact was sealed. The board was set. He had forgiven his betrayer not out of kindness, but out of a cold, calculating pragmatism. He had chosen to turn the weapon of his past against his enemies. But as he looked at the woman and the child, a disquieting thought pricked at the edges of his consciousness. In this intricate game of vengeance, who was truly the hunter, and who was the hunted? The journey to Castle Volkov was a silent, grim affair. Cassian had summoned a closed carriage, its interior lined with dark velvet, smelling of age and secrets. He had provided Alara with a heavy woolen cloak to ward off the biting wind, a gesture of practicality, not kindness. She huddled in one corner, Leo sleeping fitfully in her arms, while Cassian sat opposite her, a statue carved from shadow. He did not speak, his gaze fixed on the rain-streaked window, but Alara could feel the weight of his attention, a constant, unnerving pressure. The castle, when it finally emerged from the mist-shrouded pines, was a brutalist masterpiece of black stone and sharp angles, a fortress designed to repel the world. It clawed at the sky like a skeletal hand, more prison than palace. As they passed through the immense iron gates, Ilara saw no guards, no servants, only silent, watchful gargoyles, and the feeling of being watched by the castle itself. Inside, the opulence was staggering and suffocating. Vast halls were filled with priceless art, intricate tapestries depicting bloody histories, and furniture that belonged in a king's court. Yet it was all cold, sterile, and unused, a museum of a life, not a home. A stern, pale woman with hair pulled back so tightly it seemed to stretch her skin met them in the grand foyer. Her name was Anya, and she moved with the silent efficiency of one who had served the damned for a very long time. "Mistress," Anya said, her voice as crisp as autumn leaves, her eyes giving nothing away as she looked at Ilara and the child. "Lord Cassian has informed me of your arrival. I am the housekeeper. I will see to your needs." Cassian's instructions were simple and absolute. She and the boy are to be given the West Wing quarters. They are to be fed, clothed, and kept comfortable. They are not to leave the castle grounds. You will be their warden, Anya. See they are treated as honored guests. The emphasis on the last two words was chilling. The West Wing was luxurious, a suite of rooms with a roaring fireplace, a soft canopied bed, and even a small antechamber that Anya quickly had furnished with a finely carved cradle. Hot water was brought for a bath, and a simple but nourishing meal of broth, bread, and cheese was laid out. For the first time in months, Ilara felt a flicker of safety, a reprieve from the constant, gnawing fear of discovery. But it was a gilded cage. Every window was barred with ornate ironwork, and the heavy door to the suite had a lock on the outside. She was a prisoner, sustained by the grace of the man she had condemned. The next few days passed in a blur of surreal domesticity. Anya was a constant, silent presence, attending to their needs with a detached professionalism. She procured clothes for Ilara, simple but well-made gowns of dark wool, and soft linen for Leo. A wet nurse was found from the nearby village, a young woman named Isolde, whose husband had died, leaving her with a babe of her own and in desperate need of coin. Isolde was terrified of the castle and its master, but her maternal instincts and the generous pay outweighed her fear. She cared for Leo with a gentle hand, allowing Ilara moments of much-needed rest. Cassian remained a phantom. Ilara would sometimes catch a glimpse of him in the long, shadowed corridors, a flicker of movement at the edge of her vision, or hear the distant, melancholic notes of a piano being played in the dead of night. He was watching, waiting. He had given her a sanctuary of sorts, but he was letting the reality of her new life, her new imprisonment, sink in. He was letting her fear and uncertainty marinate before he came to collect his price. The summons came on the fourth night. Anya appeared at her door. The master requests your presence in the library. The library was Cassian's heart. 2 stories of floor-to-ceiling bookshelves crammed with volumes in a dozen languages, ancient scrolls, and modern treatises. A massive globe stood in one corner, and a complex astrolabe gleamed on a mahogany table. Cassian was standing before a large map of the region spread out on another table, small carved wooden figures placed upon it. He didn't turn as she entered. "Valerius has made his move," he said without preamble. His voice was calm, the voice of a general surveying a battlefield. "His men have been seen in Blackwood Village, asking questions about a woman and a child." Ilara's blood ran cold. So soon? "He is not a patient man," Cassian replied, finally turning to face her. He was dressed in a simple black shirt and trousers, the severe attire emphasizing the lethal grace of his form. "He will have traced you to the edge of my lands. He will suspect you have sought refuge here. But he will not dare to assault this castle directly, not yet. He needs proof. He needs a reason to bring the full might of the order down upon me. And I am to be that proof," Ilara stated, her voice flat. "Precisely," Cassian said, gesturing to the chair opposite the map table. "Sit. We have work to do. I need to know everything you know about Valerius, his methods, his beliefs, his weaknesses. The order you knew a century ago is not the same as the one that hunts you today. Tell me how he operates." And so began their strange collaboration. Night after night they would meet in the library. Ilara, hesitant at first, began to speak of her time with the order after Cassian's capture. She had not been a true member, but a pawn, a runaway girl they had taken in and used for her knowledge of the local countryside where Cassian had been living in seclusion. She spoke of their rigid hierarchy, their fanatical devotion, their reliance on ritual and scripture to guide their hunts. She described Valerius, his charisma, his ability to inspire absolute loyalty, his utter conviction that any creature of the night, including a child like Leo, was a soulless abomination to be purged from the world. Cassian, in turn, revealed his own intelligence. His influence spread far beyond the castle walls. He had agents in the village, spies in the regional capital. He knew the names of Valerius's key lieutenants, the routes their patrols took, the locations of their hidden chapels and armories. He listened intently to Ilara, absorbing every detail, his sharp mind fitting the pieces together, forming a strategy. During these sessions, the dynamic between them began to shift. It was no longer just captor and captive. It was a commander and his unwilling but vital informant. He would challenge her, question her, push her for details she had long buried. They use consecrated silver, not just in their weapons, but woven into their nets and ropes, she recalled one night, her eyes distant. And fire. They believe it purifies the soul as it destroys the flesh. Cassian made a note on his map. And Valerius himself? Does he fight? He is a strategist, not a warrior, Ilara said. He directs, he preaches. He believes his faith is his greatest weapon. He is arrogant. He underestimates his enemies, especially if he believes them to be morally or spiritually inferior. An arrogance I shall be happy to exploit, Cassian murmured, a predatory glint in his eyes. One evening, as Ilara described a particular tracking ritual the order used, she faltered, her voice catching. Cassian looked up, his expression unreadable. "What is it?" "It was the ritual they performed, the night they took you," she whispered, her gaze falling to her hands, which were twisted in her lap. "I led them to the old abbey. You trusted me. You told me it was your sanctum, the one place you felt at peace. I watched them perform the rites, consecrate the ground, so you could not escape into the earth. The silence in the room was heavy, suffocating. Cassian said nothing for a long moment. He walked over to a window, looking out into the impenetrable darkness. "I often wondered," he said, his back to her, "if you felt any remorse, or if the 30 pieces of silver were comfort enough." "It wasn't for silver," she said, her voice trembling with a century of shame. "It was for my family. My younger sister was sick with the lung fever. The order, Valerius, he promised me a cure, a relic they possessed. He said it could heal any ailment. He said you were a monster who preyed on the innocent, and that by giving you to them, I would be saving not just my sister, but the entire village." Cassian turned slowly, his face a mask of cold fury. "And did they? Did they save your sister?" Tears streamed down Ilara's face. She was dead within the week. "The relic was a fraud. He never intended to help. He used me. He used my love for my sister to trap the man to trap you." She finally broke, a sob tearing from her throat. "He told me they would take you away, that you wouldn't be harmed. I never knew they would torture you." For the first time, Cassian saw not just the betrayer, but the betrayed. Another victim of Valerius's crusade. It did not erase her sin, but it cast it in a new, more complex light. She had made a choice born of desperation and love, and had been cruelly deceived. A part of him, the cold, vengeful part, wanted to dismiss her story, to cling to the simple, clean narrative of his betrayal. But the truth he was discovering was rarely simple or clean. He had built his immortal existence on the pyre of her treachery, but now he saw that the fire had been lit by another's hand. The hatred that had sustained him for 100 years began to feel hollow. It was a borrowed rage. The true architect of his suffering was not this broken woman, but the righteous man who was now hunting his son. The fragile truce between them was tested when Leo fell ill. It began as a cough, but quickly deepened, his small body racked with fever. Isolde the wet nurse was beside herself, and even the stoic Anya showed a flicker of concern. Ilara was frantic, pacing the floor of her suite, refusing to eat or sleep. It was a human ailment, a fever of the lungs, and Cassian's vampiric nature left him powerless to help. He could command armies of shadows, but he could do nothing against a common sickness. He brought in the finest physician from the capital, a man whose discretion was bought with a small fortune in gold. The old doctor examined the child, prescribed tinctures and poultices, but Leo's condition only worsened. One night, as Ilara sat by the cradle, bathing Leo's feverish brow, Cassian entered the room. He stood by the fire, watching her, his helplessness a tangible aura around him. "He is burning up," Ilara whispered, her voice raw with exhaustion and fear. "He is so fragile." "He is my son," Cassian said, the words sounding strange and foreign even to himself. "He will not die." It was a command, an order to fate itself, but it held no power here. In her desperation, Ilara turned to him, her eyes pleading. "There is nothing you can do? No magic? No power you possess?" "My gifts are of the shadow, Ilara. They are for ending life, not preserving it," he said, his voice laced with a bitterness she had never heard before. He looked at the suffering child, his heir, the only being in the world who shared his blood, and he was utterly useless. He, who could shatter stone and move faster than the eye could see, could not soothe a simple fever. Perhaps there is something," Ilara said hesitantly. "The old tales, They speak of the bond between a sire and his progeny. They say a small amount of a sire's blood can grant strength, can heal. Cassian recoiled as if she had struck him. You would have me turn my own son into a fledgling? Condemn him to this curse before he has even lived? No, she insisted, not to turn him, just a drop, to give him the strength to fight this, to lend him your immortality, just for a moment, so his own body can heal. It was a dangerous, forbidden idea. A vampire's blood was a potent and unpredictable thing. It could enslave, it could madden, it could kill. But looking at Leo, his breaths coming in shallow, ragged gasps, Cassian felt a desperation that rivaled Ilara's. He had already lost one life. He would not lose this one. With a sharp nod, he strode to the cradle. He bit into his own wrist, the skin parting easily, and let a single ruby-red drop of blood fall onto his fingertip. It pulsed with a faint inner light, a liquid jewel of immense power. He hesitated for a fraction of a second, then gently touched his finger to Leo's lips. The drop of blood vanished, absorbed instantly. For a moment, nothing happened. Then a faint rosy color returned to Leo's cheeks. His breathing deepened, becoming more regular. The violent shivering subsided. By morning, the fever had broken. Leo was weak, but he was alive. He was sleeping peacefully, his small chest rising and falling in a steady, life-affirming rhythm. Ilara was slumped in a chair beside the cradle, asleep from sheer exhaustion. Cassian stood over them both, a silent sentinel. He had saved his son, but he had also crossed a line. He had bound the child to him, not just by bloodline, but by blood itself. A part of his dark gift now resided in Leo, a seed of the night planted in the soil of the day. He had done it to save him, but he knew with a chilling certainty that this act would have consequences. He had healed the child, but in doing so, he may have damned the man he would one day become. The complications of his unexpected fatherhood were becoming more profound, more dangerous than any hunter's blade. The incident with Leo's illness changed the atmosphere in the castle. The line between captor and captive blurred further, replaced by a shared, unspoken secret. Cassian found himself drawn to the West Wing more often, not as a warden, but as a father. He would stand in the doorway and watch Ilara sing a soft lullaby to Leo, or watch the child's clumsy attempts to grasp a wooden toy. These moments of quiet domesticity were alien to him, a language he didn't speak, but he found himself listening intently, trying to understand. He saw the fierce, unconditional love Ilara had for their son, and it stirred something deep within him, a long-dormant echo of his own humanity. He began to see her not just as his betrayer, but as Leo's mother. The two identities were inextricably linked, and it made his long-held hatred feel increasingly cumbersome. Ilara, too, saw a different side of Cassian. She saw the flicker of fear in his eyes when Leo was sick, the quiet relief when he recovered. She saw him watch his son with a profound, aching loneliness that mirrored her own. He was still a dangerous, terrifying creature of the night, but he was also a father, grappling with a love he was not equipped to handle. A fragile, tentative trust began to grow in the space between them, nurtured by their shared concern for the child who bound them together. Their strategy sessions in the library continued, but now they were colored by this new, complex dynamic. They were no longer just planning a war, they were planning the protection of their family. Cassian's spies brought word that Valerius was growing bolder. He had established a fortified base in the ruins of the old abbey, the very place where Ilara had betrayed Cassian. The sacrilege was a deliberate message. Valerius was not just hunting a monster, he was on a personal crusade. "He's trying to draw me out," Cassian said, his finger tracing the location on the map. He's desecrating my past to provoke my future. He will use the villagers, Ilara warned. He will turn them against you, whispering tales of a dark lord who steals children. He will paint you as the monster and himself as the savior. Then we must give them a different story to tell, Cassian mused. He began to move the wooden figures on the map, his plan taking shape. Valerius expects me to hide behind these walls. He expects a monster to act like a monster. He believes my power lies in fear. He is wrong. My true power lies in the fact that I am more than he could ever imagine. The plan was audacious. Cassian would not wait for Valerius to make a move. He would force his hand. He would use Ilara and Leo as the bait, but not in the way Valerius expected. They would not be cowering prisoners. They would be seen. Cassian began to orchestrate public appearances. A short, guarded ride in the carriage through the village. A visit to the village market, with Cassian's silent, imposing presence acting as a shield. He bought bread from the baker, cheese from the farmer. His transactions polite, his voice even. He wanted the villagers to see him, not as a phantom, but as a man, a lord, a father. He wanted them to see Ilara not as a prisoner, but as his consort, and Leo not as a creature of darkness, but as the heir to Volkov. It was a nerve-wracking charade. Ilara had to suppress her terror every time they left the castle. She could feel the eyes of Valerius's spies on them, could sense the hatred radiating from the shadows. But she played her part, holding Leo close, her expression serene, trusting in the lethal aura of the man beside her. The villagers were confused. The tales of the Dark Lord of Castle Volkov were contradicted by the sight of the handsome, reserved man and the beautiful, quiet woman with their child. Fear began to mingle with curiosity. Valerius was enraged. The reports from his spies were maddening. The vampire was not behaving as predicted. He was flaunting his abomination, normalizing his sin. This public display was a mockery of everything the order stood for. Valerius's arrogance, as Ilara had predicted, became his undoing. He could not stand to be ignored, to be outmaneuvered. He decided he had to escalate. He needed to shatter the peace, to remind the villagers who the true monster was. The attack came during the festival of the harvest moon. The village was alive with music and laughter, the central square lit by bonfires. Cassian, in a calculated move, had attended, standing at the edge of the square with Ilara and Leo. He wanted Valerius to see him there, a part of the community he claimed to protect. As the festivities reached their peak, a sudden, chilling cry cut through the night. Figures in dark cloaks, bearing the silver sunburst of the order, emerged from the alleys. They were not attacking Cassian directly. They were attacking the villagers. They overturned stalls, set fire to a hay cart, and dragged a young man from the crowd, accusing him of being a sympathizer. Chaos erupted. The villagers screamed and scattered. Valerius had made his move. He was showing them that the vampire's presence brought not peace, but violence. He was punishing them for their perceived tolerance. But Cassian had anticipated this. He had not come unprepared. With a low word, he pushed Ilara and Leo into the protection of a deep doorway. "Stay here," he commanded. Then he moved. He was not a blur of supernatural speed. He moved with the deliberate, terrifying grace of a predator. He disarmed the first hunter with a fluid motion, shattering the man's wrist. He threw the second into the burning hay cart. He moved among them not as a mindless beast, but as a disciplined warrior, his movements precise, economical, and utterly devastating. He was not just fighting, he was protecting. He placed himself between the hunters and the fleeing villagers, a dark shield against the Order's righteous fury. From her hiding place, Ilara watched in horrified awe. This was the power she had betrayed, a power now being used to defend the very people he should despise. The villagers, seeing the lord of the castle fighting for them, were stunned. The narrative Valerius had so carefully constructed was crumbling before their eyes. But then, from the bell tower of the village church, a new threat emerged. A crossbow bolt, trailing a thin silver wire, whistled through the air, aimed not at Cassian, but directly at her, at Leo. There was no time to think. Cassian was too far away, engaged with the hunters in the square. Ilara's body reacted on pure instinct. She twisted, shielding Leo with her own body, and cried out as the bolt slammed into her shoulder. The pain was a white-hot agony. The silver burned her flesh, a searing, unnatural cold. The wire attached to the bolt went taut, and she was violently yanked off her feet, dragged out from the doorway and into the open. "The harlot and the abomination!" a voice boomed from the darkness. Valerius. He stood on the church steps, his face illuminated by the spreading fires, his expression one of triumphant rapture. "Behold, the creature's weakness! We have the mother and the child!" Cassian turned, his face a mask of incandescent rage. He saw Ilara on the ground, the bolt in her shoulder, Leo crying in her arms. He saw the wire leading into the darkness, and he saw Valerius, his old tormentor, smiling. He had fallen into the trap. His attempts at subtlety, his careful manipulation of public perception, it had all been a prelude to this. Valerius hadn't cared about the villagers' opinions. He had only cared about drawing out Cassian's one true vulnerability. The hunters in the square disengaged, forming a perimeter, their swords and crossbows now all trained on the vampire. Cassian was surrounded, cut off from Ilara and his son. "Release them, Valerius." Cassian's voice was a low, deadly rumble. "Come now, Lord Volkov," Valerius sneered, savoring his moment. "You know the laws of the Order. The beast must be destroyed. The abomination must be cleansed. And the sinner," he gestured to Ilara, who was struggling to sit up, her face pale with pain, "must atone." He raised a hand, and two more hunters emerged, grabbing Ilara and hauling her to her feet. One of them snatched Leo from her arms. "No!" Ilara screamed, a primal cry of maternal anguish. "Please, take me! Do what you want, but leave him be!" "It is too late, sinner," Valerius said. He walked down the steps, taking the crying child from his man. He held Leo up to the firelight, examining him with a look of clinical disgust. "It has its father's eyes. Such a pity they must be closed permanently." Time seemed to slow down for Cassian. He saw the scene with a preternatural clarity, the fear in the villagers' faces, the triumphant smirk on Valerius's, the absolute despair on Ilara's. He felt the silver net of the trap closing around him. Valerius expected him to surrender, to beg, to trade his life for theirs. It was the noble, heroic thing to do. It was what a human would do. But Cassian was not human. And his rage, a cold, ancient thing he had kept chained for a century, was finally breaking free. He looked at Ilara, at her pain-filled eyes, and saw not betrayal, but sacrifice. She had shielded their son without a moment's hesitation. She had taken the bolt meant for him. In that moment, the last vestiges of his old hatred turned to ash. The debt was paid. She was no longer his betrayer. She was the mother of his child, and she was in the hands of his enemy. He did not surrender. He did not beg. He looked directly at Valerius, and he smiled. A true smile, full of fangs and death. "You are right about one thing, prelate," Cassian said, his voice echoing with an unnatural resonance that made the very air vibrate. "It is time for atonement." And then he unleashed hell. He didn't move towards Valerius, he moved away. With a speed that was truly inhuman, he was suddenly beside the church bell tower. With a single contemptuous strike, he shattered the stone foundation. The ancient structure groaned, swayed, and then began to collapse inwards, sending a plume of dust and debris into the square, cutting off Valerius's line of sight and sending his hunters scrambling for cover. It was a diversion. In the heart of the chaos, Cassian became a phantom. He moved through the dust and screaming, a whisper of death. One hunter fell with a choked cry, his throat torn out. Another crumpled, his spine shattered. He was not fighting them, he was executing them. Valerius, shocked by the sudden turn of events, bellowed orders, but his men were in disarray. He held Leo tighter, the child his only shield. He saw Cassian emerge from the dust cloud, his eyes glowing like embers, his fine clothes now splattered with the blood of the Order. "You cannot win, demon," Valerius shouted, his voice laced with the first hint of fear. "God is on my side." "Your God has no jurisdiction in my lands," Cassian snarled, stalking forward. The remaining hunters fell back, their fanaticism finally broken by the raw, primal terror the vampire radiated. Ilara, forgotten in the chaos, used the moment to act. The pain in her shoulder was a raging fire, but the sight of her child in Valerius's hands was a greater agony. She saw a discarded hunter's blade lying on the cobblestones nearby. Ignoring the searing pain, she ripped the crossbow bolt from her own shoulder with a strangled gasp. She staggered forward, blood soaking the front of her gown, and snatched up the sword. It was heavy, unwieldy in her untrained hand. The hunters holding her had fled in the confusion. She was free. She did not run. She charged. With a desperate, feral cry, she ran straight at Valerius, the man who had ruined her life twice. He turned at the sound, his eyes wide with disbelief, to see the broken woman not fleeing but attacking. He was a preacher, not a warrior. He fumbled, trying to draw his own sidearm while still holding Leo. That moment of hesitation was all Ilara needed. She swung the heavy blade in a clumsy two-handed arc, not at Valerius, but at the arm that held her son. The sword, heavy with her desperation, crunched against his wrist. Valerius screamed in pain and shock, his grip on Leo faltering. The child tumbled from his grasp. Cassian was there in a heartbeat, catching Leo before he hit the ground. He held his son close, shielding him with his body, and turned his full, murderous attention to the now disarmed and terrified prelate. Ilara collapsed to her knees, the sword clattering to the ground, her strength finally spent. She had done it. She had saved her son. Valerius stared at the approaching vampire, his face a mask of disbelief and terror. "Abomination!" he stammered, scrambling backwards. You will burn for this." Cassian stopped a foot away from him. He looked down at the whimpering man, then at Ilara, who was being helped to her feet by a stunned but grateful village baker. He looked at his son, safe in his arms. The rage that had fueled him for a century was gone, burned away in the fire of the last few minutes, replaced by a cold, clear sense of purpose. Killing Valerius now would be an execution, not a victory. It would make him the monster Valerius always claimed he was. And he had just shown these people and himself that he was something more. "No," Cassian said, his voice quiet but carrying across the now silent square. "You will not be granted a martyr's death." He turned his back on the cowering prelate, a gesture of ultimate contempt. He walked over to Ilara, who was leaning heavily on the baker, her face ashen. He gently passed Leo into the baker's wife's waiting arms. Then he scooped Ilara up into his own arms as if she weighed nothing. Her head lulled against his chest, her eyes fluttering closed. "Your crusade is over, Valerius," Cassian called out over his shoulder, his voice ringing with absolute authority. "Leave my lands tonight. If you or any of your followers are found within my domain by sunrise, I will hunt you down, and I will show you the true meaning of damnation. Now you will all bear witness. The Order of the Dawn came to Blackwood to bring fire and death, and it was the monster who protected you from the saints." He said nothing more. Cradling Ilara, he walked away from the fires, away from the cowering hunters and the awestruck villagers, and back towards the dark silhouette of his castle. The message was clear. The old stories were wrong. The balance of power had shifted. The Lord of Castle Volkov was not a beast to be feared, but a power to be respected, a protector, a father. And he had just declared war on heaven itself for the sake of the woman who had once sent him to hell. The days that followed the battle in the village square were quiet and tense. The castle's physician tended to Ilara's wound, declaring it clean but deep. The silver had done its damage, leaving a puckered, ugly scar that would serve as a permanent reminder of her sacrifice. Cassian rarely left her side during her recovery. He would sit in a chair by her bed, reading from one of his ancient books, a silent, watchful guardian. He did not speak of what had happened, of her charge at Valerius, or of his own unleashed fury. There was no need. Something fundamental had been broken between them that night, and something new was being forged in its place. The creditor and the debtor were gone, replaced by two wounded people bound by a shared past and a shared future, their son. Leo was blissfully unaware of the turmoil. He was doted upon by Isolde and Anya, and his gurgles and cries brought a fragile sense of normalcy to the grim fortress. Cassian would often take the child from his cradle and simply hold him, studying his tiny features with a look of profound wonder, as if trying to solve the greatest mystery of his long existence. He was a father. The word still felt strange, ill-fitting, like a borrowed coat. But with every passing day, it settled more comfortably upon his shoulders. True to his word, Valerius and the remnants of his hunters had vanished. Cassian's spies confirmed they had fled the region entirely, their spirits broken, their leader humiliated. The threat was gone, for now. But Cassian knew the Order would not forget. They would regroup. They would send someone else, someone more powerful, more ruthless than Valerius. He had won the battle, but the war for his family's survival had just begun. The villagers of Blackwood, however, told a different story. They spoke of how the Dark Lord of the castle had protected them from the zealots. They left offerings at his gate, baskets of bread, autumn vegetables, a bottle of homemade wine. They were gestures of respect, of gratitude, of fear, yes, but a different kind of fear, the fear of a power that could destroy, but had chosen to protect. When Ilara was strong enough to walk, she found Cassian on the battlements, looking out over the vast expanse of his domain. The autumn wind whipped at his dark coat, and he seemed a part of the stone and sky, an ancient, solitary figure. She came to stand beside him, pulling her cloak tight against the chill. "They are gone?" she asked quietly. "For now," he replied, not looking at her. "The order has a long memory. As do I." The silence stretched between them, filled with the unspoken weight of a century of pain. It was Ilara who finally broke it. "Why?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "That night, in the village, you could have let them kill me. It would have been justice." Cassian finally turned to face her. His twilight eyes were clear, holding no trace of the rage she had once seen in them, only a deep, profound sorrow. "Justice," he said, the word tasting like ash in his mouth. "I spent 100 years convincing myself that my vengeance was justice, that your death would balance the scales. I was wrong." He looked away, back towards the horizon. "When I saw Valerius holding Leo, threatening to harm him simply for the crime of existing, I understood. I understood the desperation that drove you to make your choice all those years ago. The desperate love of a parent for their child. A love that can make you betray everything you believe in." Ilara stared at him, her heart aching. It was not an absolution, but it was something far more precious: understanding. "What you did," he continued, his voice low, "running at him with that sword, wounded as you were, that was not the act of a betrayer. It was the act of a mother. You saved our son, Ilara. The dead between us, it is settled." He said the words, and the very air around them seemed to lighten, as if a great, invisible chain that had bound them together for a century had finally shattered. Tears welled in Ilara's eyes, but for the first time, they were not tears of fear or shame. "What happens now, Cassian?" He was silent for a long time, the wind his only answer. The future was a blank, unwritten page. He had built his immortal life around a singular purpose, vengeance, and that purpose was now gone. He was adrift in an eternity he no longer understood. He looked at the woman beside him, the ghost who had haunted him, who was now just a woman. A brave, foolish, desperate woman, the mother of his child. "I do not know," he admitted, the words a confession of vulnerability he would not have been capable of just weeks ago. "The order will return. The world is not safe for him." He looked down at the castle, his fortress, his prison. "Nor is this place a home. It is a tomb filled with memories." A new covenant was needed, a new way forward. The old life of shadows and solitude was no longer enough. He had something to protect now, something more precious than his own immortal life. "They will hunt him because of me," Cassian said, a cold certainty in his voice. "As long as he is seen as the son of a vampire, he will never be safe. They will see my darkness in him, and they will seek to extinguish his light." An idea, radical and terrifying, began to form in Ilara's mind, a path she had never dared to consider. "Then, perhaps," she said, her voice trembling but firm, "he should not be the son of a vampire alone." Cassian looked at her, confused. "What are you saying?" "Leo is of two worlds," she explained, finding strength in her conviction. "He has your blood, but he has my heart. He is both darkness and light. What if we were a family, not just in secret, hidden behind these walls, but in the open? What if the Lord of Volkov took a wife? What if the people saw not a monster and his prisoner, but a lord and his lady, a family? It is harder to demonize a man who is a husband and a father than a solitary creature of the night." It was a mad proposal, a marriage of convenience, a political alliance. A human and a vampire, bound together not by love, but by a shared purpose, the protection of their son. It would be a lie, a grand deception played out on the stage of their lives. But it was a lie that could save Leo. It would give him a name, a legitimacy, a shield against the world's hatred. Cassian stared at her, seeing the brilliant, desperate strategy behind her words. She was offering him a new identity. Not Cassian the Forsaken, the vengeful wraith, but Cassian Volkov, lord of these lands, husband, father. It was a mask, but it might be a mask that, over time, could become the truth. It was a chance not just to protect his son, but to reclaim a piece of the humanity he thought he had lost forever, to build a future instead of just avenging the past. He thought of the long, lonely centuries stretching before him, the cold emptiness of his castle. Then he thought of the sound of Leo's laughter echoing in the halls. He thought of this woman who had faced down his greatest enemy with a stolen sword and a mother's fury. He had chosen to forgive her to serve his vengeance. Now he would choose to bind himself to her to serve his son's future. Without a word, he reached out and took her hand. Her fingers were cold, but he wrapped his own around them, his touch gentle. It was not a declaration of love, but it was a promise, a pact, a new beginning forged in the ashes of their shared painful history. He led her away from the battlements, back towards the heart of the castle. As they walked, the first rays of the morning sun crested the distant mountains, bathing the black stone of the fortress in a soft, golden light. For the first time in 100 years, the dawn did not feel like a threat to Cassian. It felt like a promise. The image was a powerful one, the vampire and his betrayer walking hand in hand out of the darkness and into the light, not as lovers, but as allies, parents, and partners in a new and dangerous world. Their war was far from over, but for the first time, they would not face it alone.